There is a quiet shift that happens before the end of anything meaningful. It does not arrive loudly, it whispers. Words are often the first place where distance begins to appear, long before actions fully reveal the truth. At the start of a connection, communication feels alive. There is presence, curiosity, and a natural flow of energy. Messages are thoughtful, responses are timely, and there is a sense that what you say matters. But when interest begins to fade, this rhythm slowly changes. Not all at once, but in small, almost unnoticeable ways. The shift is subtle. Replies become shorter, less expressive, and sometimes delayed without explanation. Where there was once enthusiasm, there is now neutrality. Where there was once effort, there is now convenience. He may still respond, but the depth is gone. The questions disappear. The engagement weakens. Conversations begin to feel one-sided, as if you are carrying something that was once shared. This is where many people make the mistake of focusing only on presence instead of quality. They tell themselves, at least he's still replying, or maybe he's just tired. But presence without intention is not connection. Words that lack energy, consistency, and meaning are not neutral. They are signals. They reveal that something internally has shifted, even if it has not yet been openly expressed. When someone is genuinely interested, communication is not something they struggle to maintain. It becomes a natural extension of how they feel. They want to know about your day. They remember small details. They respond not out of obligation, but out of desire. So when that desire fades, it quietly reflects in the way they speak. Not through dramatic statements, but through absence. Absence of warmth, absence of curiosity, absence of effort. You may begin to notice that you are the one initiating more often. You are the one asking questions, keeping conversations alive, trying to recreate the energy that once existed naturally. This imbalance is not accidental. It is a reflection of emotional investment shifting from two people to one. And the more you try to compensate for that shift, the more exhausting it becomes. There is also a change in tone. Words become more casual, sometimes even distant. Pet names fade. Emotional expressions reduce. What once felt personal now feels generic. It is as if the connection has been placed on a lower priority without being directly stated. And because nothing explicit has been said, it creates confusion. You begin to question yourself instead of observing the reality in front of you. This is why awareness is essential. Not overthinking, not analyzing every word with anxiety, but calmly observing patterns. One delayed reply means nothing. One off day means nothing. But repeated changes in communication form a pattern, and patterns always tell the truth. Words may not always be direct, but they are rarely meaningless. When you learn to listen beyond the surface, you begin to understand that fading interest does not always announce itself clearly. It reveals itself through inconsistency, through reduced effort, and through the quiet disappearance of emotional presence. And the earlier you recognize these shifts, the more clarity you gain, not about them, but about what you are experiencing. Because in the end, communication is not just about speaking. It is about showing up. And when someone slowly stops showing up through their words, it is not something to ignore, explain away, or chase after. It is something to see clearly, without illusion and without denying what is already being revealed. Busy is one of the most commonly used words when interest begins to fade, yet it is also one of the most misunderstood. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, even acceptable. Life is demanding, responsibilities exist, and everyone experiences moments of pressure. But the truth does not lie in the word itself. It lies in how consistently it is used and what it replaces. When someone values a connection, they do not suddenly become a person with no time. Instead, they become someone who makes intentional space, even within a full life. A simple message, a brief check-in, a moment of presence. These are not time-consuming acts. They are reflections of priority. So when busy becomes a repeated explanation rather than an occasional reality, it begins to signal something deeper. At first, it may feel harmless. You might tell yourself that they are going through a stressful period or dealing with something important. You choose patience, understanding, and flexibility. But slowly, a pattern forms. The gaps between conversations grow longer. Plans become uncertain or postponed. Responses arrive with less energy, sometimes hours or days later, often without real engagement. And each time, the same explanation appears again. I've just been really busy. The danger is not in the word itself, but in how it subtly trains you to accept less without questioning it. You begin adjusting your expectations. You stop asking for consistency. You lower your standards. Not because you truly want to, but because you are trying to preserve something that once felt meaningful. In doing so, you shift from being an equal participant in the connection to someone who is waiting, hoping, and accommodating. But time is not something people simply have or don't have. Time is something people allocate. Even in the busiest lives, people still check their phones, speak to friends, scroll through content, and engage with what matters to them. The difference is not availability, it is intention. When someone is interested, they do not need perfect conditions to show it. They find small ways to stay connected, even during chaos. When interest fades, communication begins to feel like a task rather than a desire. It becomes something to fit in rather than something to look forward to. And busy becomes a convenient shield, one that avoids deeper explanation while keeping just enough connection alive to prevent complete disconnection. It creates a space where things are not fully ended, but no longer truly growing. This creates confusion. You may wonder whether you are expecting too much or being unreasonable. You may hesitate to express your needs because you do not want to seem demanding. But genuine connection does not make you feel like you are asking for too much when you simply want consistency and presence. It does not leave you constantly waiting for availability that never seems to arrive. Over time, you may notice that you are the one adjusting your schedule, your energy, and your expectations around their buzziness. You become more available, more patient, more understanding, while receiving less in return. This imbalance is not created overnight. It develops gradually, reinforced by repeated acceptance of minimal effort. The word busy can easily disguise emotional distance because it sounds logical and socially acceptable. But when it becomes a pattern rather than an exception, it stops being an explanation and starts becoming an indication, not of a full schedule, but of a shifting priority. And when you begin to observe this clearly, without immediately excusing it or internalizing it as your fault, you start to see that the issue is not time itself. It is where that time is being placed and what is no longer being chosen within it. Dismissive phrases often appear quietly, yet they carry a weight that slowly weakens emotional connection. When someone says, "You're overthinking," it may sound harmless at first, almost like reassurance. It can feel as though they are trying to calm the situation or bring you back to ease. But beneath that surface, something more subtle is happening. Your feelings are being reduced instead of understood. At the beginning of a meaningful connection, there is space for expression. You can share thoughts, concerns, and emotions without feeling judged or minimized. There is curiosity instead of defensiveness. Questions are met with openness, not resistance. But when interest begins to fade, this openness starts to close. Conversations that once felt safe begin to feel fragile, as if expressing yourself risks being dismissed rather than heard. When someone repeatedly labels your concerns as overthinking, it creates a quiet imbalance. Instead of addressing what you feel, they shift the focus onto how you feel it. The issue is no longer about the situation. It becomes about you being too much, too sensitive, or too analytical. This redirection may seem small, but over time it changes how you relate to your own emotions. You begin to hesitate before speaking. You question whether your thoughts are valid. You wonder if you are creating problems that do not exist. This internal doubt does not come from nowhere. It develops through repeated experiences of being dismissed. Each time your feelings are minimized, a small layer of self-trust is reduced. Dismissal is not always loud or aggressive. Often it is calm, casual, and indirect. That is what makes it difficult to recognize. It does not look like conflict, yet it creates distance. It does not sound like rejection, yet it weakens connection. Over time, the emotional gap grows, not because of what is said, but because of what is avoided. When someone is still emotionally invested, they do not fear your thoughts. They seek to understand them. Even if they disagree, they engage. They listen, respond, and remain present in the conversation. There is a willingness to meet you where you are, rather than pushing you away from it. So when that willingness disappears, it is not simply a communication issue. It reflects a deeper withdrawal. You may start to notice that important conversations become shorter or are quickly redirected. Instead of exploring what is wrong, the focus shifts to ending the discussion. Phrases like, "It's not that deep," or "You are making it a bigger deal than it is," begin to appear. These statements do not resolve anything. They simply close the door on understanding. This creates a cycle where you either push harder to be heard or pull back to avoid being dismissed again. Neither option feels natural. One leads to frustration, the other to silence. And in both cases, the connection loses its balance. Communication becomes less about sharing and more about managing reactions. Over time, you may find yourself carrying thoughts alone, even while still in the connection. The emotional space that once existed between two people becomes something you navigate by yourself. And this is where the real distance forms. Not in physical absence, but in emotional disengagement. When dismissal becomes a pattern, it is no longer about a single phrase or moment. It becomes a reflection of how much someone is willing to hold space for you. And when that space continues to shrink, it is not something that can be repaired through explanation alone. It is something that must first be seen clearly, without ignoring the quiet impact it has already created. Lack of clarity in a connection often appears disguised as patience, freedom, or going with the flow. At first, it may feel natural to allow things to unfold without pressure. You may tell yourself that not everything needs to be defined immediately, that time will reveal direction. But when clarity continues to be avoided, it begins to signal something deeper than simply taking things slow. When someone is genuinely interested, their intentions may not always be perfectly expressed, but they are felt. There is a sense of direction, even in the early stages. Their words and actions align in a way that makes you feel considered and included in their emotional space. You do not have to constantly question where you stand, because their effort provides reassurance without needing constant explanation. But when interest begins to fade, that direction slowly disappears. Conversations about the future become vague or are gently avoided. Questions about where things are going are met with uncertainty, deflection, or phrases that keep everything undefined. Statements like, "let's not label this," or "let's just see where it goes," begin to repeat, creating a space where nothing is clearly acknowledged. This absence of definition is not always neutral. It can create a situation where one person remains emotionally invested, while the other gradually detaches, without accountability. Without clarity, there is no structure. And without structure, expectations cannot be fairly shared. You may continue to show up with intention while the other person remains comfortably undefined, giving only what feels convenient in the moment. Over time, this imbalance becomes emotionally exhausting. You may find yourself analyzing small details, searching for meaning in inconsistent behavior, or holding on to moments of connection as proof that something real still exists. But clarity does not require constant interpretation. When something is meaningful and mutual, it does not leave you in a state of ongoing uncertainty. Avoidance of clarity is often a quiet form of withdrawal. It allows someone to remain present without fully committing, to receive connection without fully offering it. And because nothing is clearly stated, it becomes easy to hold on to hope, even when the reality is already shifting. When direction is missing for too long, it is not because the answer does not exist. It is because it is not being offered. And in that absence, what you feel is not confusion by accident, but a reflection of something that is no longer being clearly chosen. There is a particular kind of sentence that sounds gentle, almost protective, yet carries a quiet finality within it. I don't want to hurt you. On the surface, it appears considerate, as if the person is trying to shield you from pain. It can feel like care, like honesty, like emotional awareness. But when you listen more deeply, it often reveals something else. An early step toward emotional distance. This phrase rarely appears in moments of strong connection. It emerges when something has already begun to shift internally. Instead of expressing commitment or reassurance, it introduces a subtle separation. It prepares the ground for withdrawal, not through direct rejection, but through soft wording that feels less confrontational. Hearing this can create confusion. You may interpret it as a sign that they value you enough to be careful with your feelings. You may believe that it reflects depth or sincerity, but in many cases, it is not about protecting you. It is about easing their own exit. It allows them to acknowledge change without fully taking responsibility for what comes next. As this phrase repeats or lingers in your mind, you may notice a change in your own behavior. You become more cautious, more accommodating, trying not to push too hard or expect too much. You begin to adjust in subtle ways, hoping to avoid the very outcome that has already been hinted at. What makes this moment significant is not just the words themselves, but the shift they represent. It is no longer about building something forward. It becomes about managing an ending that has not yet been openly declared. And in that space, the connection begins to lose its stability, not through sudden action, but through quiet, emotional preparation. And now, you stand at a point of awareness, not confusion, not denial, but clarity. You have seen the patterns. You have heard the words beneath the words. You have felt the shift that your heart was trying to explain long before your mind accepted it. Do not ignore this moment, because this is where many people lose themselves. Not when the other person walks away, but when they stay and keep accepting less than what they once knew was real. You do not need louder signs. You do not need a final explanation. You do not need to wait for certainty when the truth has already been repeating itself quietly. Respect is not something you chase. Attention is not something you beg for. Love is not something you have to decode endlessly. When interest fades, let it fade without chasing it. When effort disappears, do not replace it with your own. When words lose their meaning, stop holding onto them as if they still carry truth. There is strength in walking away from what no longer chooses you. There is power in seeing clearly, even when it is uncomfortable. And there is peace in no longer trying to hold on to something that is already letting go. You were not meant to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's uncertainty. You were not meant to wait in silence, hoping to be chosen again. You were meant to stand in your worth, without hesitation, without fear. So listen carefully, not just to them, but to yourself. If something feels different, it is. If something feels distant, it is. And if something feels like it is ending, it already is. Do not ignore this. Because the moment you choose yourself over confusion is the moment everything begins to change.